My neighbor knocked on my door at midnight. Your security camera recorded something last week. I checked the footage she mentioned. Then I saw myself walking into the woods at 3 a.m. I don't remember any of this. The footage was grainy, shot in that eerie green night vision glow that makes everything look like a horror movie. And there I was, walking barefoot across my own backyard in nothing but boxer shorts and a white undershirt. My eyes were open but empty, staring straight ahead at nothing and everything, and I was heading directly toward the tree line that separated our suburban development from the 200 acres of protected woodland that the Homeowners Association had always bragged about in their marketing materials. Gloria Pemberton stood in my living room at 12:17 a.m. on a Wednesday night, her tablet clutched in her weathered hands, and she kept rewinding the same 15-second clip over and over. "That's you, Daniel," she said. "That's definitely you." I watched myself disappear into the darkness between the oaks and maples, and my wife Allison came down the stairs rubbing her eyes, asking what was going on, and I couldn't answer because I genuinely didn't know. I had no memory of that night. None at all. Gloria was 73 years old, a retired pharmacist who'd lived next door to us for the 6 years since Allison and I had moved into this house, and she'd installed her elaborate security camera system after a string of package thefts had swept through our neighborhood the previous summer. Her cameras covered not just her property, but due to their wide-angle lenses and elevated positions, significant portions of the surrounding yards as well. She'd always apologized for this, saying she wasn't trying to spy on anyone, just wanted to protect her deliveries and maybe catch whoever kept letting their dog use her flower beds as a bathroom. I'd never minded. I'd never had anything to hide. But now I was staring at footage of myself doing something I had absolutely no memory of, and the timestamp read 3:14 a.m., October 23rd, exactly 8 days before Gloria knocked on my door. Allison put her hand on my shoulder. "You were in bed that night," she said. "I remember." But the footage didn't lie, and neither did the confused terror settling into my chest like cold water filling a basement. I'd been living what I thought was an unremarkable life for the past several years, the kind of comfortable existence that doesn't make for interesting conversation at parties, but provides a certain peace that I'd learned to appreciate after the chaos of my 20s. I was 38 years old, a project manager for a commercial construction company called Reinhardt Development, and I'd been with them for 9 years. Allison and I had been married for 7 of those years, no children by choice, just the 2 of us and a 10-year-old beagle named Copper, who spent most of his time sleeping on the couch and occasionally howling at nothing. We lived in Meadowbrook Estates, a subdivision of about 60 homes built in the late 1990s, located 30 miles outside of Philadelphia in a town called Ardmore. Our house was a 3-bedroom colonial with blue shutters and a mortgage we could comfortably afford. Our neighbors were friendly, but not intrusive. Our weekends were filled with farmers markets and home improvement projects, and the occasional dinner party with Allison's colleagues from the architectural firm where she worked as a senior designer. It was boring in the best possible way. But something had shifted in the past few months, something I couldn't quite identify at the time, but that became clearer in retrospect. I'd been sleeping poorly, waking up exhausted even after 8 hours in bed, and I'd developed this persistent brain fog that made me feel like I was always operating at about 70% capacity. My doctor, Dr. Lawrence Hanover, a general practitioner I'd been seeing for 4 years, had attributed it to stress and the changing seasons, and had suggested I try melatonin and reduce my caffeine intake. I'd done both, and nothing had changed. Allison had been concerned, in her quiet way. She'd started making me herbal tea before bed, chamomile with honey, and she'd suggest I take hot baths to relax. She'd been so attentive, so caring, and I'd thought myself lucky to have such a supportive partner. I'd thought wrong about a lot of things. Looking back now, I can see the red flags that I'd been too trusting, too comfortable, too in love to notice. The way Allison always insisted on making my evening tea herself. The way she'd started keeping the bedroom door closed at night, something she'd never done before. The way she'd deflect whenever I mentioned feeling strange. After Gloria left that night, I sat at the kitchen table until nearly 3 a.m., watching and re-watching the footage she'd sent to my phone. Allison had gone back to bed, saying there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe I'd just been sleepwalking due to stress or the change in my sleep supplements. But I couldn't shake the image of my own blank face, my own shuffling gait, my own hands hanging limply at my sides as I walked into those woods, like I had a destination in mind, like I knew exactly where I was going, even though my conscious mind had been completely absent. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I told my supervisor, Margaret Brennan, that I had a stomach bug, and then I drove to Best Buy and purchased 4 wireless security cameras, a 2-terabyte storage drive, and enough cable to wire my entire backyard. If I was sleepwalking into those woods, I needed to know. I needed to see everything. I spent the entire day installing cameras that covered every angle of my property, including one pointed directly at the path I'd taken in Gloria's footage. I told Allison about the cameras when she got home from work, and her reaction was the first thing that truly set off alarm bells in my mind, though I didn't fully recognize it at the time. She went pale, just for a second, and her hands tightened on her purse strap before she forced a smile and said that was probably a good idea, that we should figure out what was happening, that she'd been worried about me. Then she asked, too casually, what the camera coverage looked like, and whether they'd capture inside the house as well. I said no, just the exterior and the backyard. Something flickered across her face that I couldn't read. Relief? Concern? Both? She kissed my cheek and went to start dinner, and I sat in the living room pretending to watch television while my mind raced through possibilities I didn't want to consider. That night, she made me chamomile tea again. I watched her hands as she prepared it, looking for anything unusual, but she caught me watching and smiled, and I felt guilty for being suspicious of my own wife. I drank the tea. I went to bed, and I woke up the next morning with dirt between my toes. The second escalation happened exactly as the first one had, except this time I had footage. I pulled up the recordings on my laptop before I even showered, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and there I was again. 3:22 a.m., walking across the backyard in the same empty-eyed trance, heading for the same gap in the tree line, disappearing into the same darkness. But this time, I'd positioned a camera to follow the path further, and I watched myself walk about 50 yards into the woods before stopping at the base of a massive oak tree with a split trunk. I stood there for almost 4 minutes, just standing and staring at the ground, and then I turned around and walked back to the house and went in through the back door, which I'd apparently unlocked from the inside. I had no memory of any of this. None. I checked my phone's step counter and found that I'd walked over 2,000 steps between midnight and 6 a.m. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee mug. Allison came downstairs and asked if I'd slept well, and I said yes, and I didn't tell her what I'd seen. For the first time in our marriage, I deliberately lied to my wife. I called Dr. Hanover's office that morning and insisted on an emergency appointment, which his receptionist scheduled for 2 p.m., after I explained, in admittedly frantic terms, what had been happening. I spent the hours between the footage revelation and the appointment sitting in my car in the parking lot of a coffee shop, watching the videos over and over, trying to find something in my own face that would explain what was happening to me. I looked dead. Not metaphorically, not just tired, but actually deceased, like someone had animated my corpse and sent it walking through the night. My eyes didn't blink in the footage. My arms didn't swing naturally. I moved like a puppet being guided by strings I couldn't see, and the thought that kept circling my mind was this. What was I doing at that tree? What was I looking at? Dr. Hanover, when I finally sat in his office and showed him the footage on my phone, went very quiet for a very long time. He asked about my stress levels, my alcohol consumption, my sleep hygiene, my family history of somnambulism. I answered everything honestly. He referred me to a sleep specialist at Penn Medicine named Dr. Nina Castellanos, and he scheduled me for a full blood panel. The blood work came back 3 days later, and that's when the first real crack appeared in the foundation of my life. Dr. Hanover called me personally, which was unusual enough to make my stomach drop before he even spoke. Daniel, he said, we found something unexpected in your results. Your blood showed elevated levels of zolpidem. That's the active ingredient in Ambien. I told him I'd never taken Ambien in my life, never had a prescription for it, and he went quiet again. That's concerning, he said, because it didn't get there by itself. I sat in my car outside the grocery store where I'd been picking up ingredients for dinner, and I felt the world tilt sideways. Someone was drugging me. Someone had access to my food, my drinks, my home, and they were putting sleep medication in something I consumed regularly enough to show up in my blood work. My mind immediately went to Allison's chamomile tea, the tea she insisted on making every night, the tea she'd started preparing around the same time my exhaustion and confusion had begun, the tea I drank right before the blackouts happened. I didn't go home that night. I told Allison I had an emergency work situation that required me to drive to the job site in Wilmington and that I'd probably be there late, maybe even overnight. She sounded disappointed, maybe a little too disappointed, and she asked if I wanted her to leave some tea in a thermos for when I got back. I said no thank you. I drove to a Marriott near the airport instead and checked in under my own name, using my own credit card, not caring if she saw the charge because I needed to think, and I couldn't do that while sitting across the dinner table from a woman who might be poisoning me. I lay on the hotel bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, and I made a list in my notes app of everything I knew. The sleepwalking had started approximately 3 months ago. The chamomile tea ritual had started approximately 3 months ago. The blood work showed zolpidem. I had no prescription for zolpidem. I had no memory of taking zolpidem. I slept uninterrupted that night for the first time in months. No strange footage, no dirt between my toes, no gaps in my memory. I woke up at 7 a.m., feeling more rested than I had in longer than I could remember, and that clarity was the final confirmation I needed. Something in my home was causing the episodes, and the most likely vector was the tea my wife made for me every single night. I called Dr. Castellanos' office and moved my appointment up to that afternoon, explaining that I had new information that made the consultation urgent. Then I called a lawyer, a woman named Meredith Crane, who'd handled the real estate closing when Allison and I bought our house, and who I'd kept in my contacts for exactly this kind of situation, the kind of situation I'd never imagined I'd actually face. I need advice, I told her. I think my wife might be drugging me, and I don't know why, but I need to document everything legally before I confront her. Meredith didn't ask unnecessary questions. She told me to come to her office at 4 p.m. after my medical appointment. Dr. Nina Castellanos was 52 years old, a sleep specialist with 23 years of experience and a wall full of credentials that I barely registered as I sat in her examination room and told her everything. She listened without interrupting, taking notes on a tablet, and when I finished, she asked questions that made me realize she was treating this not just as a medical issue, but as a potential crime. She ordered a comprehensive tox screen that would test for over 100 substances, and she asked if I had any of the tea left at home, any that I could bring in for analysis. I said I'd get some. She looked at me with eyes that were kind but serious and said, "Mr. Mercer, if what you're describing is accurate, someone has been administering a controlled substance to you without your knowledge or consent. That's a felony. Whatever is happening in those woods during your episodes, whatever the purpose of this drugging might be, you need to understand that you may be a victim of a serious crime." The word victim sat in my chest like a stone. Meredith Crane was the opposite of Dr. Castellanos, young, intense, speaking in rapid-fire sentences that left little room for emotional processing. She was 34, a partner at a small firm that specialized in family law and personal injury, and she treated my situation like a puzzle she was eager to solve. "First," she said, "we document everything. Every piece of footage, every medical record, every communication. We create a chain of custody that will hold up in court if it comes to that. Second, we don't confront your wife directly until we know what she's been doing during these episodes and why. If she's drugging you and guiding your behavior while you're incapacitated, there's a reason. We need to find that reason before she has a chance to destroy evidence. Third, and I need you to hear this clearly, Daniel, you need to consider that your wife may be planning to harm you in some way that hasn't happened yet. People don't drug their spouses recreationally. There's always an end game. I nodded and signed her retainer agreement and felt like I was watching my marriage disintegrate in real time. I went home that night armed with knowledge I wished I didn't have, and I performed normalcy like my life depended on it, which it possibly did. Allison greeted me at the door with a kiss, asked about the work emergency, made sympathetic noises about the stress I must be under. She offered to make tea. I said I was trying to cut back on liquids before bed because I'd been getting up too often to use the bathroom. She accepted this explanation without visible concern, though I thought I saw something flash in her eyes, something calculating that disappeared before I could be sure it was there. We ate dinner together, watched television together, went to bed together, and I lay in the darkness listening to her breathe, wondering who I was lying next to, wondering what she'd done to me during all those nights I couldn't remember. When I was certain she was asleep, I got up and went downstairs and collected the chamomile tea bags from the cabinet, sealing them in a plastic bag I'd brought home from Meredith's office for exactly this purpose. The lab results came back in 4 days. Meredith called me at 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday, her voice tight with controlled anger. The tea was contaminated, concentrated zolpidem, enough in each bag to knock out a grown man while leaving him ambulatory and suggestible. Your wife has been chemically incapacitating you for at least 3 months, probably longer. This is premeditated, Daniel. This is calculated. The question now is why. I sat in my car, again, because my car had become the only private space I trusted, and I tried to process what I was hearing. Allison, my wife of 7 years, the woman I'd built a life with, had been systematically drugging me every night, watching me walk into the woods in a state of pharmaceutical hypnosis, and doing this for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. What was at that tree? What had she been making me do? The answer came faster than I expected, and it came from the last person I would have thought to ask. Gloria Pemberton knocked on my door again, this time at 6 p.m. on a Saturday, her face lined with worry and something else that looked like guilt. "I have more footage," she said. "I should have shown you earlier, but I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to cause problems between you and Allison." I felt my blood pressure spike. "What footage?" I asked, and she handed me a USB drive and said that maybe we should watch it together, that maybe I'd want someone there when I saw what was on it. We sat at my kitchen table while Allison was supposedly at a yoga class, and Gloria's footage revealed something that made the room spin. I wasn't alone during my sleepwalking episodes. Allison was with me. In the footage, time-stamped 3 weeks before my conversation with Gloria, I watched my wife lead me by the hand across the backyard, guide me toward the tree line, and walk beside me into the woods like she was taking a pet for an evening stroll. She was fully dressed, alert, aware. She was the puppet master, and I was the puppet. I called Meredith. I called Dr. Castellanos. I called a private investigator named Raymond Foley, who Meredith had recommended, a former Philadelphia police detective with 31 years of experience who specialized in domestic surveillance. Everyone agreed. We needed to know what was happening at that tree. We needed to know what Allison had been making me do, or helping me do, or watching me do in those woods for the past 3 months. Raymond suggested we check the area during daylight while Allison was at work, document whatever we found, and photograph everything before confronting her or involving the police. I agreed. We set a time for Monday morning. I spent the weekend pretending nothing had changed, drinking tea I poured down the sink when Allison wasn't looking, staying awake through sheer force of will, watching my wife for any sign that she knew I was on to her. She seemed perfectly normal, loving even. She suggested we take a trip soon, maybe to the shore, somewhere we could reconnect. I smiled and said that sounded wonderful, and felt like I was going to vomit. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn sunlight that makes everything look sharp-edged and significant. Raymond Foley met me at the edge of my property at 9 a.m., after Allison had left for her office, and we walked into the woods together, following the path I'd memorized from watching my own sleepwalking footage dozens of times. The oak tree with the split trunk was about 200 yards from my backyard, clearly visible once you knew where to look, and when we reached it, Raymond started examining the ground with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent decades looking for things people didn't want found. "Here," he said after about 5 minutes. He was pointing at a section of disturbed earth at the base of the tree, partially covered with dead leaves, but clearly different from the undisturbed soil around it. Someone's been digging here, multiple times. The soil composition is inconsistent. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs as he pulled out a small folding shovel and began to carefully excavate. What we found in that hole changed everything, and I need to be careful here about how I describe this, because the legal proceedings are still technically ongoing, and my lawyer has advised me to avoid certain specific details that might complicate the criminal case. But I can tell you this. We found a waterproof container buried about 18 inches down, a black plastic box with a latching lid, and inside that box were items that made Raymond Foley, a man who'd seen 31 years of the worst humanity had to offer, go completely silent for almost a full minute. There were documents, financial records, a passport that wasn't mine but had my photograph in it, evidence of accounts I'd never opened, transfers I'd never made, and photographs, dozens of photographs of Allison with a man I'd never seen before, taken in locations I didn't recognize, some of them intimate enough to leave no doubt about the nature of their relationship. There was also a letter, typed and unsigned, that described in chilling detail a plan to establish evidence of erratic behavior and unexplained nighttime activities that would support a future claim of spousal abuse. Raymond called the police from the woods. Not 911, but a direct number for a detective he'd worked with during his time on the force, a woman named Lieutenant Patricia Danner, who headed the Fraud and Financial Crimes Unit. He explained what we'd found, where we'd found it, and how I'd come to discover it. She arrived within an hour with 2 uniformed officers and a forensics technician, and they processed the scene while I sat on a fallen log and tried to understand what my wife had been doing to me. Lieutenant Danner, 51 years old with 27 years on the force, explained it to me in terms I could barely absorb. "It's an elaborate setup," she said. "Based on what we're seeing here, your wife has been building a case against you for months. The drugging, the sleepwalking, the erratic behavior, the evidence of financial impropriety in your name. She's been creating a paper trail that would make you look like an abuser, an embezzler, maybe even a danger to yourself and others. If this had continued, if you hadn't caught on, she could have used all of this to destroy you in a divorce proceeding, take everything you own, and possibly have you arrested for crimes you didn't commit." The man in the photographs was identified that same day. His name was Gregory Ashworth, 43 years old, a real estate developer from Delaware who, according to Lieutenant Danner's initial research, had a history of partnering with women to execute complex financial fraud schemes. He'd been investigated twice before but never charged, always managing to stay one step ahead of prosecution, always finding someone else to take the fall. The passport we found had my name and photo, but was registered to an address in Florida I'd never visited, attached to accounts that had received almost $200,000 in wire transfers over the past 6 months, transfers that could easily be traced back to my legitimate bank accounts if someone, say, an ambitious prosecutor or a suspicious wife, knew where to look. Allison and Gregory had been building an alternate version of me, a shadow Daniel who committed financial crimes while sleepwalking, who behaved erratically, who left evidence of violence and instability wherever he went. And when they were ready, they were going to let that Shadow Daniel take the fall for everything. Allison was arrested at her office at 4:17 p.m. that Monday, in front of her colleagues and her boss, and the architect she'd been working with on a project for the past 3 months. Lieutenant Danner told me later that she went pale when she saw the officers, but she didn't run, didn't resist, just asked, very quietly, what had taken them so long. Gregory Ashworth was picked up the following morning in Wilmington, trying to board a flight to Miami with a carry-on bag full of cash and a laptop that, according to the forensic analysis, contained detailed records of every scheme he'd ever run, including his collaboration with my wife. The prosecutor, a woman named Christine Barlow, who'd built her career on complex financial fraud cases, called their collected evidence one of the most comprehensive self-documented crime sprees she'd ever seen. Gregory had kept records of everything, including emails between him and Allison, that described their plan to frame me, drug me, and ultimately either have me imprisoned or committed to a psychiatric facility. They'd been planning this for almost 2 years. 2 years of marriage that I'd thought was happy while my wife was building a cage for me out of chemicals and paperwork. The trial took place 8 months later, after a pre-trial period filled with motions and depositions and evidence reviews that made my head spin despite Meredith's patient explanations. Allison and Gregory were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, assault by means of drugging, and a dozen lesser counts that I couldn't keep track of. The prosecution presented the evidence methodically: the contaminated tea bags, my blood work, Gloria's footage, the buried box with its damning contents, the email chains, the financial records, the fake passport, the photographs. My wife sat across the courtroom from me for 3 weeks, never meeting my eyes, while lawyers argued about what she'd done to me and why. Her defense tried to claim that Gregory had manipulated her, that she'd been coerced, that she was a victim too. The jury didn't believe it. Neither did I. Allison was sentenced to 12 years in state prison for her role in the conspiracy. Gregory Ashworth received 18 years. The aftermath of something like this doesn't end with a verdict. I sold the house in Meadowbrook Estates 3 months after the trial, unable to sleep in the bedroom where my wife had watched me drink poison night after night, unable to walk through the backyard without seeing myself shuffling toward the trees like a zombie. Gloria Pemberton hugged me on my last day in the neighborhood and told me she was sorry she hadn't said something sooner, sorry she'd waited until the footage became impossible to ignore. I told her she'd saved my life, which was probably true. Without her midnight visit, without her security cameras and her courage to show me what she'd seen, Allison's plan would have continued until I was either in prison or in a psychiatric ward, my reputation destroyed, my freedom stolen, my entire identity replaced by the shadow version she'd been constructing. I moved to a small apartment in the city, closer to work, with no backyard and no woods and no trees that reminded me of what I'd found buried beneath them. Dr. Castellanos continued to monitor my recovery for almost a year, tracking my sleep patterns and brain chemistry as the effects of the chronic zolpidem exposure gradually faded. She told me I was lucky, that long-term exposure to that level of sedatives could have caused permanent cognitive damage, and that the fact that I'd noticed the problem when I did was probably the only reason I'd recovered as fully as I had. I started therapy with a psychologist named Dr. Adam Renner, who specialized in trauma and betrayal, and I spent months unpacking the layers of what Allison had done, what it meant about our marriage, what it meant about my ability to trust another person ever again. The answer to that last question is still unclear. I'm 40 now. I've been divorced for almost 2 years. I date occasionally, but I can't seem to let anyone make me tea, and I check my security cameras every morning before I trust that the night passed normally. Sometimes I still wake up at 3 a.m., for no reason I can identify, my heart pounding, my feet already moving toward the floor before I realize that I'm awake, that I'm in control, that no one is guiding me toward a destination I can't remember. I check my phone, check the camera feeds, check my own hands for dirt or scratches, and then I lie back down and stare at the ceiling until the sun comes up. The sleep specialist says this is normal, a kind of conditioned response that may fade with time or may persist forever, my brain's way of protecting itself from ever being that vulnerable again. I've learned to live with it. I've learned to live with a lot of things that I never expected would be part of my story. But I'm alive, and I'm free, and the woman who tried to steal my life is sitting in a cell in a facility outside of Harrisburg, and that has to count for something, even on the nights when nothing else does. The last time I talked to Lieutenant Danner, about 6 months after the trial, she told me something that I think about more often than I probably should. She said that in her experience, most victims of schemes like this never figure out what's happening, and they end up exactly where their abusers want them, broken and confused and blamed for crimes they didn't commit. She said I was one of the lucky ones, and I know she's right, but the word lucky feels strange when applied to a man whose wife drugged him for 3 months and made him dig holes in the woods at 3 a.m. Still, I take her point. I'm here. I'm telling this story. I have the chance to warn other people that the person sleeping next to them might not be who they think, that trust can be a weapon, that sometimes the call is coming from inside the house, literally. So if you're reading this and something feels off in your life, something you can't explain, something that doesn't add up, trust your instincts. Check your security cameras. Get your blood tested. And never ever drink tea you didn't make yourself. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.